So I'm recording my homily for the 25th week of Ordinary Time. The gospel that we had today is a story from Luke chapter 16, the very beginning of Luke chapter 16. And I'll be going into the parable that Jesus uses in that story. I've been struggling with the flu, so if at some point I have to cut it off because I start coughing or something, just to know that that's what it's about. You know, I would like to believe that as Catholics and as Christians, that we have a heart for the underdog. We have a heart for people who are struggling, for people who are getting picked on, or as a modern day term, people who are getting bullied. That as Christians and Catholics, we just have a heart for those people. And so all the virtues that Jesus desires for us to foster in our life and grow by His grace is virtues of kindness and generosity and all these things that we would show to someone, especially to someone who's struggling in life and needs support, needs help. And so whenever I hear about people having discussions on poverty, we as Christians have a pretty prominent place in that often because of our love for those who are struggling, those who are suffering. When I hear people talking about the root causes of poverty, what is causing poverty in our world? There's one of the reasons that I don't hear people talk a lot about, but I think we do need to talk about it. And that is corruption. When people talk about poverty, they'll talk about, and rightly so, breakdown of the family or other things going on, not having sufficient employment, financial issues in a community, resources, all those things. They're very important. But very rarely do you hear people say, we need to talk about corruption. Now, I've been very blessed, and I've had the opportunity to go to a couple countries that are very poor. And so one of them was Haiti. Went to Honduras several times, been to Mexico many times, the Philippines, and even a little village up in Alaska, which was very poor. And in all those places, the one thing that was common was corruption. Corruption dominates. And when corruption dominates, you end up having lots of people who suffer because of that corruption. So I want to talk a little bit about corruption. Now, in the first reading today is from Amos. And you can read that. You can go online, look at the readings for the 25th Sunday, and read the reading on Amos. So Amos is a prophet, and he's talking about corruption. He's talking about people whose sole endeavor is to make more, is to get more. And so they'll cheat, they'll steal, they'll do whatever they have to in business so that they can get ahead, so that they can do better. But he talks about it in the sense of people who are stepping on the poor. So in other words, to get ahead, at some point they have to step on other people. And that is corruption. And so Amos is just blasting it. He's saying we can't have that, because when we have that, then we have destitution. We have people who cannot provide even for the most basic things. And so let's talk about corruption. One of the trips I took was to the Honduras. And in Honduras, we were visiting an orphanage, and at one point, our group was transporting supplies to the orphanage. And we were driving along the freeway, and one of our vehicles got pulled over for speeding. And he wasn't speeding, but he got pulled over for speeding. And the police officer just wanted a bribe, right? That's all it was about. He just wanted $10 or $20. He just wanted a bribe. Our driver refused to give him any money. And so obviously the police officer became very irritated with it, and he used lots of pressure. And our driver, who was a native, he just refused. He would not give him the bribe. Now, we had plenty of money. We were down there to help, and so we had plenty of money, and so money wasn't the problem. We could have easily paid the police officer off. Now, in Spanish, the term for this bribe, for this form of corruption, is the bite. And don't ask me to say the Spanish word. I always forget what it is. It's like mordida or something. Anyways, but to take a bite, and so they want to take a bite out of your wallet, right? They want a bribe. So the driver refused to give in. And so eventually the police officer's superior comes and he lets him go, and it was fine, after a couple hours of this ordeal. So afterwards, I was asking the driver, why didn't you just pay him? Why didn't, we had the money, why didn't you just pay him? And he said, and this is where our driver was a prophet, at least to me, he was a prophet. He says, as soon as you give in to small forms of corruption, it's only a matter of time before those little forms of corruption grow. You give to a police officer once a bribe, and before you know it, your president in the country is corrupt. Because you begin to create a whole foundation, a whole infrastructure that enables and accepts corruption as a way of life. And so I really admire that driver for sticking to his guns, especially in Honduras, where they had like the highest murder rate that year in the entire world. He was brave. Now, his actions correspond to the second half of the gospel today. And Jesus says, the person who is trustworthy in very small matters is also trustworthy in great ones. Our driver, right? He refused to give in to the corruption. The person who is dishonest in small matters is also dishonest in great ones. And so if you think about it, if you think about where does these companies, these really big companies, and the people who are in charge, and they've become corrupt, how did that happen? Well, it began when they were not in charge. It began when they were much lower. And they got away with something. They got away with a little form of corruption, and people accepted it. And maybe there was an atmosphere of it. And then eventually that person worked their way up in the ranks, and before you know it, they're embezzling millions of dollars, right? Or billions of dollars. And then it starts to impact the whole company, and then it impacts who? The employees, the people who are doing the work, the people who are perhaps not corrupt. And it begins to destroy. And so Jesus himself, I think, is beginning to say here in the gospel, he's saying, you have to be trustworthy as a Christian and as a disciple. You have to be trustworthy in small things, because if we're not, we're never going to be trustworthy in big things. Now, there's all kinds of little ways that we are tempted to become corrupt, right? If we're really honest, if we're humbly honest, there's little ways that we are. I remember in the 3rd grade, right? My teacher was Miss Neuenfeld. Well, I had a plan to cheat on my spelling test. And I planned it all out, and it was going to work, and it was going to be slick, and I was, for once, going to get a good grade on a spelling test, because spelling, I was horrible. Still am. Thank goodness for Microsoft Word spell check, right? So, this is probably, now that I think about it, that's kind of a form of cheating, I suppose. Anyways, so 3rd grade, I'm cheating on my spelling test. I think I'm going to get away with it, and I get caught, right? Miss Neuenfeld had eyes in the back of her head. So I get caught. And the more I think about it, I've gotten caught in everything I've tried to do. And I think it was in the 3rd grade I began to realize I am not cut out for a life of crime. I am not slick. When I would lie to my parents, I would always get caught, right? When I would steal, I always got caught. When I would cheat, I always got caught. And I really give thanks to God now for that, because I was being taught that corruption in here It's not acceptable. It's not part of the gospel. It's not part of being a Catholic. I'm not sure that's our reputation as Catholics, though. Do we have a reputation for not being corrupt? I don't know. I don't think so. At least not right now, right? And so we want to rebuild that. And we begin with the small things inside our heart. I remember also when I was growing up, my parents were very firm with us on movies. And they would never, ever let us see an R-rated movie. One day, my parents went to see an R-rated movie, which they never did. But they went to the movie theater, and they went to see an R-rated movie. And I remember thinking to myself, how come I can't see an R-rated movie, but they can? And so immediately, even though I was a little kid, I recognized the inconsistency. Now, yes, I was a little kid, so I shouldn't see those things that maybe an adult can handle. But there was still a hypocrisy. There was still an inconsistency in that. Now, when my parents got home, they kind of sat us down and told us that they had made a big mistake and that they shouldn't have done that, right? And that it was not appropriate and they were sorry. And so there was a lesson there that I think they had learned or they had taught us about integrity. At least that's the lesson I was learning about integrity. And integrity is necessary to root out those little temptations of corruption. Many, many years ago, somebody went to confession and they said, Father, I've been stealing cable TV for 20 years. He says, is that a sin? It's like, well, yes. But that's not going to hurt anybody. I'm not hurting anybody. They're a big company, right? How am I hurting them? Because it is corruption. And as soon as we begin to do things that are corrupt, we then create an atmosphere for it, especially with our children, right? As parents, it's like, God bless you, right? You're raising your kids in a very difficult time. And the second they go out that door, when they graduate from high school and they're going off to college, and they have to implement everything that you've tried to teach them, they enter into a world filled with temptations to become corrupt in all different ways. And so you pray that they have the wherewithal to resist those temptations, but sometimes all they have to resist is your example. Because if your example did not correspond to your lessons, to your teachings, to the teachings that they learned here in church, they're going to go by your example. Because the example is more powerful than our words. And so we want our example to be pure. We want it to be free of corruption. So that your kids, as they go forth, they will not be so easily preyed upon by the corruptions that are out there. That they can be strong and they can be good in living the gospel. There are all kinds of things, right? About 6 months ago, I gave a homily where I talked about the human heart. And so our very heart is designed to be uncorrupted, right? It's designed to hold only one type of love. And so there is a type of love that is designed to let out, to dispel, to let it drain out, if you will. But sometimes we're very tempted to try to fill our heart with that type of love. That type of love is called eros, right? It's selfish love. It's all the things I like. And so there's things that are not sinful. I want a bigger house. I want a nicer car, a newer car. I want to take nicer vacations. I want to have food that tastes really, really good. That's why we have so many food channels. It's all about food that tastes good. It's not about feeding the hungry. It's about food that tastes... Okay, anyways. And so there's all these things. They're not necessarily sinful, right? But we try to fill our heart with them. The internet, Facebook, all these things that we try to cram in, and we think it'll satisfy our heart, and it's all for me, and the heart lets it all out. And so in the end, we actually feel more empty. Because we're not filling it with the one type of love that Jesus designed our hearts for, which is agape. right? Agape love. And so that's love of the other. It's when I show love for God, when I show love for my neighbor, I begin to fill my heart. And it doesn't drain out. It stays there. And it fills and fills and fills, right? So that's the type of love that we want. Now, the other type of love, eros, there's also sinful examples which really go down the path of corruption very quickly. And so, what are some examples of that? Smoking, right? Nobody needs to smoke. It destroys the body. We don't need to do that. And nobody ever confesses smoking. Maybe they should. Smoking, drinking to excess, drinking to drunkenness. We do it, we try and fill that heart. It doesn't work, right? The heart doesn't like that. Neither does the liver. But the heart, sorry. And the drugs, right? We use drugs because we're trying to escape whatever it is. And we try to fill the heart and it doesn't work, right? And so all these things, cheating on our taxes and all these things that we do that are illegal, that are bad for us, we do because we want. It doesn't work. Agape. It is the solution to corruption. It is the solution to corruption. Kind of a nice story. A couple weeks ago, one of the parishioners who's here in one of our parishes owns a company, and he gave me a tour. And as an engineer, I love getting a tour of companies where they're manufacturing things. I love seeing the technology of it. And so as we're walking around, one of the things he says, when my family started this company, we knew that we were not going to just do it for money. That we needed to do it for something more than that. And he came from a big family, and so family's important. And so in creating this working environment, you could tell they were trying to create somewhat of a family environment. And I thought that was really neat, because he's not doing it for himself per se. He's doing it for his employees. He's doing it that they have a working environment that's a good working environment, where there's respect and kindness and all these things, right? And he's treating his employees with respect. He's treating them with dignity. And he even went a little bit farther than that. One of the things that was unique I noticed was he hires a lot of Hispanics. And we expect that in working in the agricultural industry, in the construction industry. But in the tech industry, that's not very common. Even in technological manufacturing, you don't see that. And so I asked him about that, because I've been in different Hispanic communities, and that's very unusual. And he said, they're just a natural fit here. One, they're really, really hard workers, but more than that, they bring in a sense of family, right? They bring in a sense of loyalty, they bring in a sense of faith, they bring in a sense of family, and that fits. And so I thought that was a really, really great example of the opposite of corruption. He's doing it for something other than himself. He's doing it for the sake of the other. So that agape love is there, right? As a beautiful example. I was reading in the news 2 or 3 days ago, and so there's a story about a university back east, and this university received a $4 million gift from one of its employees. So one of 's librarians had passed away, and so he willed his money back to the university, $4 million. And you're thinking, how did a librarian save up $4 million? Well, he saved every penny. And he wasn't like Ebenezer Scrooge miser, but he did save. And so he never was married. So obviously he never had all those expenses of kids and everything. And he had a very comfortable life. He lived a very simple life. His interests, his hobbies required no money. He loved his job. He loved the kids at the university. He was a very friendly man. He loved the library. And so when he donated the money to the university had to decide what to do with the money. And so one of the things they did, they took $1 million of it, and they went and bought a brand new giant screen TV for the football stadium. Now, they tried to justify it, but many people didn't buy it because they felt like there was something very wrong. You have a very simple man who loves the library at the university. He leaves all his money that he worked really hard for, and they're going to go blow it on a TV screen for the football stadium. There was one person who was interviewed in this news article, and they said, it was very, very blunt, they said, the people who are responsible for this are going to end up in the 9th circle of Dante's Inferno. Now, Dante wrote a fictional account of hell, purgatory, and heaven, but the Inferno is about hell. And so it's this journey, this fictional journey of people wandering through hell and describing all the different levels through hell. Now, I didn't remember what the 9th circle of hell was, the 9th level, and so I had to go back and look it up. And so I Wikipedia'd it, and I went and looked. Well, the 9th circle is the lowest of the lowest circles in hell. Now, so it was not a very good compliment that this person was saying, but it was even more than that. And so the person in the 9th circle of hell, that you have all these different stages in the 9th circle, there's different levels. And the very, very bottom one, this is where Satan is frozen at the very bottom of hell up to his waist, right? So Satan is frozen there. But it is reserved for traitors. It is reserved for those who are treacherous. And so they were saying that what these leaders of this university did was treachery towards that man. It was treachery what they did. It was greedy. It was not on any level thinking of him and what was close to his heart. It was not agape love, right? I thought that was an interesting example of the dangers of corruption. Now, let's go into the first part of the gospel, because the first part of the gospel actually is really difficult to understand. And so in the first part of the gospel, you have the story of a man who's an administrator. He's like the accountant or the bookkeeper, but he has lots of authority and he has control over the money of his owner or of the boss of this business, right? And so he often handles the money, he handles the transactions, and so he has access to lots of money. And so his owner finds out that he's not being honest. He's embezzling, he's stealing from him. And so he tells him, he says, go create an account of all my resources because I'm firing you. Now the thing was, he didn't fire him on the spot, but he sent him back. He still has authority over his resources. Now, personally, I would have taken his keys and fired him, right? Hand over your keys, you're gone. He didn't do that. And I think there's a first lesson there about how God deals with us when we do go astray, when we become corrupt in our heart, when we sin, when we think that we're following Jesus' teachings, or we say we are, but really we're not. Deep down, we're not. And so God doesn't just fire us. He doesn't just zap us and send us to the 9th circle of hell, right? He lets us wallow. He lets us go down that slippery slope. That's interesting. Why does God let us do that? So the owner of the business lets him do that. And so he goes, and what does he do? He doesn't go and correct what he does. He doesn't go and create a very honest accounting of everything. No, he begins to panic, and he's very narcissistic. And so he says, oh man, what am I going to do? I'm being fired. I don't want to do any manual labor, right? Because that's just hard. I don't want to do any real work. And I don't want to beg because that's just degrading and that's humiliating, and I don't want that. And so what he does is he creates a system of cheating his owner, but creating a system of people who are grateful for his corruption. They benefit from his corruption. And so when he's fired, they'll accept him and they'll take care of him, right? Man, he is good, right? He is so good at being bad. You have to, and so that's what the owner does. The owner doesn't get all mad at him and want to beat him and send him to jail. The owner turns to him and says, wow, you are good. You are really good. Seems kind of strange, right? Can you imagine Jesus looking at somebody who's really, really corrupt and saying, dang, you are good, good job. I can't imagine Jesus doing that. But he's saying that. So why is he saying that? Why is he commending this man for being so good at being so bad? Now, as I was reading that, I was thinking to myself, oh man, in our political election going on right now, sometimes it feels like it's a competition to see who's more corrupt, right? I mean, all these stories coming out about this person doing this and this person, and all these examples of clear corruption. Now, how does that impact us? Do we look at them and say, whoa, wait a minute, we're not going to have a president who's corrupt. I don't care what your beliefs are. You're not going to be our president. We don't do that, do we? If we have one particular candidate that we really like, we like their take on issues, but they've got all this corruption going on, it's like, well, we just excuse it. Because we like their view on things. We like their take on the political matters. And so we excuse their corruption. And then we begin to enable them to be corrupt. And then guess what? We become part of the corruption. Let's go back into the story. So you have the master saying, wow, you're incredible. You're slick, right? It's amazing what you can do in doing evil. So he's doing all these things so that he has people who will take care of him after he's fired. But then there's a very important line, and this gets at, I think, the full meaning of this parable. And so Jesus says in this gospel, I tell you, make friends for yourselves with dishonest wealth, so that when it fails, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. The thing is, Jesus created our hearts. He knows us. He knows us better than we know ourselves. And so when we become corrupt, He knows it's never going to satisfy. It's never going to fill our hearts. The heart just lets it out, right? There's only one thing that'll fill it, and that's that love that comes by God's grace. Because God is love. God is agape love. And so that love that comes from God is the only thing that'll satisfy. And so He knows that when we become corrupt, that it will never satisfy, and eventually we'll come to a realization, right? And then we'll turn back. Now, what does that sound like? You remember the gospel from last week? The story of the prodigal son, right? And so what does he do? He goes to his father and he takes and he takes and he takes. And he takes all of his inheritance, and then he goes over here and he blows it all. He wastes it completely. And he finds himself mired with the pigs. But then he says, oh, I will go back to my father.